I never thought I'd find myself at war with my own neighborhood over something as strange as water, but life has a way of surprising you. My name is Daniel Carter, and I've lived in the Pinebrook Hills subdivision for nearly 12 years. I'm a structural engineer by trade, the kind of guy who likes quiet weekends, fishing trips, and the kind of peace you only get when you're staring out at a lake in the early morning mist. When I bought my property, what attracted me most wasn't the house itself, though it was a decent two-story brick with a wide porch. It was the land behind it. Acres of rolling field that sloped down to a creek-fed reservoir I had the legal right to manage. The previous owner had built a small but sturdy dam decades ago, and by the time I came along, the water had formed into a wide, mirror-like pond. Over the years, with my engineering background, I reinforced the dam, expanded the spillway, and created what many neighbors jokingly called Carter Lake. To me, it wasn't just a lake. It was a sanctuary. I stocked it with trout and bass, built a little dock where I'd take my kayak out, and often invited kids in the neighborhood to fish with me when their parents said it was okay. The lake became part of my life's rhythm, the place where I could escape after long hours of blueprints, meetings, and construction site chaos. At first, nobody minded. In fact, for the first 10 years, the Homeowners Association, our infamous Pinebrook Hills HOA, didn't say a word. They liked to micromanage everyone else's yard colors, mailbox designs, and even how many cars could be in your driveway. But somehow, my lake flew under the radar. Maybe it was because the original property deed, which I'd studied like gospel, made it clear that the water rights were mine. Not the HOA's, not the county's, mine. I paid extra property taxes on the reservoir land. I paid for the permits to maintain the dam. I paid for liability insurance in case some teenager snuck in at night and fell off the dock. Everything was above board, airtight, and legal. But then, as with all stories of conflict, someone new moved into the neighborhood. Her name was Patricia Holloway, and she was the type of woman who saw herself less as a resident and more as a queen. Within weeks of moving in, she ran for president of the HOA and, unsurprisingly, won. She had the kind of personality that made people both admire and fear her. A sharp tongue, expensive suits, and a way of making threats sound like polite suggestions. Where others might smile and say, "Oh, I don't think that follows the bylaws," Patricia would lean forward, narrow her eyes, and say, "We'll fine you until you comply." At first, Patricia ignored me. She had bigger targets. Neighbors who hadn't edged their lawns perfectly or who dared to hang laundry on a line in the backyard. But eventually, she noticed the lake. Maybe it was the time she came jogging by and saw a group of neighborhood kids pulling fish out of the water. Maybe it was when her real estate friends mentioned how private water access could add tens of thousands of dollars to a property's value. Or maybe it was just because Patricia was the kind of person who couldn't stand not being in control of something. Whatever the reason, she started asking questions. First, it was small talk. "Daniel, that's such a beautiful pond you have there. How much water do you think it holds?" Then it became sharper. "I noticed the level seems higher than last year. Are you diverting from the creek? Do you have permission for that?" I knew where this was heading. I'd seen her do it to others. She'd start friendly, then suspicious. Then finally, she weaponized the HOA bylaws like daggers. The official letter came on a Tuesday. It was hand-delivered to my mailbox in an envelope stamped with the HOA's emblem. Inside was a formal notice. I was being fined $500 for owning excess water beyond community allowance. I laughed out loud when I read it. Excess water? Community allowance? None of that language even existed in the bylaws. I pulled out the HOA's own rulebook, a binder I kept on my office shelf, and flipped through it. They had clauses about pool enclosures, backyard sheds, roofing colors, even Christmas decorations, but nothing about reservoirs, ponds, or water rights. This was pure fabrication. I called Patricia that night. "This fine isn't valid," I said. "The reservoir is private property. It's on my deed and the county recognizes my rights." Patricia's voice came back sharp as a blade. "Daniel, you don't understand. That much water belongs to the community spirit. It's unfair for one homeowner to monopolize a resource. We'll continue issuing fines until you comply." I should have ignored her. I should have shrugged, thrown the letters in a drawer, and gone about my life. But something in me, The part of me that had built that dam with my own hands, the part of me that had kept those waters clean and safe for over a decade, snapped. This wasn't about water anymore. It was about someone trying to bully me out of something I had earned and protected. Over the next few weeks, the letters multiplied. First it was $500, then $1,000, then threats of a lien on my house. I contacted a lawyer who confirmed what I already knew. The HOA had no legal claim, but Patricia wasn't aiming for the law. She was aiming for intimidation, and the neighbors, most of them too afraid to oppose her, stayed quiet. Some whispered that I should just play along to avoid trouble, but I wasn't going to give in. The final straw came when Patricia organized what she proudly called the Summer Garden Gala. She sent out invitations to the entire subdivision, promising live music, fine wine, and catered food in her meticulously landscaped backyard. Flyers went up at the community center. Everyone was buzzing about it. And then, 2 days before the event, I got another letter. This one wasn't just a fine. It was an ultimatum. Failure to remit payment for accumulated water usage fines, it read, will result in HOA action, including but not limited to property seizure. That did it. That was the moment I decided that if Patricia wanted to make water a weapon, then I'd give her more water than she could ever handle. I looked out at my dam, at the spillway gate I'd built with my own hands, and a plan began to form. One that would make sure her precious garden party was remembered for years to come. Once the decision had rooted itself in my mind, there was no going back. For years, I had prided myself on being a man of patience, someone who didn't pick fights, who kept his head down and lived quietly. But Patricia's campaign against me had crossed a line. It wasn't just about the absurdity of owning too much water. It was about principle, about the sheer arrogance of one person thinking they could rewrite the natural order and strip me of what was rightfully mine. That night, after reading her ultimatum, I walked down to the dam with a flashlight in one hand and a thermos of coffee in the other. The moon reflected off the smooth surface of the lake, turning it into a sheet of silver. The frogs croaked in the reeds. Somewhere in the distance, a pair of owls hooted back and forth. I crouched by the steel gate of the spillway, ran my hand across the cold metal, and felt the weight of the decision pressing on me. I knew that if I opened it fully, the water would rush out with a force that could scour the creek bed and overflow its banks. I also knew exactly where the excess water would end up. Patricia's prize garden sat on low ground, just below the creek's natural run. For years she had boasted about her imported rose bushes, her terraced flower beds, her delicate stone fountains. She spent thousands on landscapers to keep everything perfect. And in a single night, all of it could be washed away. Of course, I wasn't going to act recklessly. That wasn't who I was. I spent the next day calculating. I measured water levels, noted rainfall patterns, and checked soil saturation downstream. My engineering mind switched on like it always did when facing problem. Assess the data, model the outcome, minimize the risks. I wasn't trying to destroy anyone's home or endanger lives. I only wanted to send a message, a dramatic reminder that nature and property rights weren't toys for Patricia to manipulate. I set up stakes along the creek, measuring how far the water might spread. I even consulted old county floodplain maps, making sure that the flow would concentrate exactly where her backyard lay vulnerable. The more I planned, the more a kind of grim satisfaction filled me. Patricia wanted to accuse me of hoarding water? Fine. I'd give her so much water, she wouldn't know what to do with it. In the days leading up to the gala, the neighborhood buzzed with preparations. Trucks came and went from Patricia's driveway, unloading tents, catering supplies, sound systems. I watched from my porch as hired workers carried crates of champagne and cases of wine into her garage. A band arrived for rehearsal, their music drifting faintly through the trees. It was all so grand, so excessive, that it made her earlier accusations against me all the more hypocritical. Here she was, throwing an event designed to flaunt her wealth and control, while at the same time nitpicking me over a body of water I had tended with my own sweat and time. At night, when the subdivision grew quiet, I'd walk down the dam and check the gate again, rehearse in my mind how and when I would release it. Timing was everything. If I opened it too early, the water would disperse before a party reached full swing. Too late, and the guests might already be leaving. No, I needed precision. I needed the perfect moment. But even as my plan crystallized, doubts flickered in the back of my mind. I thought about the kids who loved fishing at my lake, the elderly couple who liked to walk by the water in the evenings, the quiet balance I had maintained for so long. Was I risking that for the sake of revenge? Was I becoming the very thing I despised, a person willing to bend the environment and the rules just to prove a point? Those thoughts haunted me at night. But each morning I'd find another letter from the HOA shoved into my mailbox, each one more aggressive than the last. One morning, I discovered Patricia herself standing on the edge of my property, clipboard in hand, peering out at the water like she was measuring it with her eyes. "You'll have to lower that reservoir eventually, Daniel," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. No one man should control the flow of nature. I stared at her for a long time, then said simply, "Careful what you wish for." She frowned, clearly not understanding the double edge of my words, and marched back to her Mercedes. That was the moment my doubts vanished. She wanted control? She wanted nature tamed? Fine. She would see what untamed water really looked like. The day of the gala arrived sunny and clear. I woke early, brewed a pot of coffee, and sat on my porch watching the neighborhood stir to life. Guests began arriving around noon, dressed in summer linens and pastel dresses, parking their cars along the cul-de-sac. Laughter and chatter filled the air. From my porch, I could hear the clink of champagne glasses, the soft hum of a string quartet playing beneath a white canopy. Patricia floated among the crowd like royalty, her wide-brimmed hat casting sharp shadows across her painted smile. She didn't glance in my direction, though I knew she saw me sitting there. Maybe she thought she'd already won, that her fines and threats had cowed me into submission, but she had no idea what was coming. I stood, stretched, and made my way down the slope to the dam. My heart hammered as I approached the spillway gate. The sun glinted off the steel handle. The air smelled of warm grass and summer blossoms. I rested my hands on the mechanism and took a long, steadying breath. This was it, the culmination of weeks of harassment, planning, and resolve. Slowly, deliberately, I began to turn the wheel. At first, the change was subtle. The water shifted, eddies forming as the gate cracked open. A low gurgle echoed down the spillway, growing louder as the flow increased. I opened it wider and the gurgle became a roar. The lake surged forward, rushing to the concrete channel, foaming white as it spilled into the creek below. I watched the water pick up speed, snatching twigs and leaves, sending them tumbling downstream. Within minutes, the creek transformed from a lazy trickle into a churning current, its banks trembling under the sudden force. I closed my eyes and imagined the path it would take, bending to the woods, cutting past a walking trail, and finally spilling into Patricia's perfectly manicured backyard. I imagined the guests at her gala, wine glasses in hand, laughter dying in their throats as the first wave lapped at their shoes. The thought filled me with both dread and exhilaration. And then, as the water thundered away from me, I turned and climbed back up the hill. From my porch, I could see nothing yet, only the distant canopy of white tents and the flutter of dresses in the afternoon sun. But I knew the creek would not take long. I sat down, poured myself a glass of iced tea, and waited. My fingers tapped restlessly on the arm of the chair. My pulse quickened. Somewhere out there, Patricia's perfect world was about to collide with mine, and for once, I would not be the one yielding ground. The sound reached me before the sight did. At first, it was faint, carried by the breeze, a ripple of shrieks, startled laughter, the chaotic hum of voices rising in confusion. I leaned forward in my porch chair, eyes narrowing toward Patricia's estate. The string quartet had stopped playing. I could hear the abrupt silence between notes, the bowstrings hanging midair as musicians gawked at something none of them had rehearsed for. Then came the scream, sharp, high-pitched, unmistakable. I knew at once that the creek had broken into her paradise. My heart raced, but my face stayed calm as I sipped my iced tea. The trickle had become a rush, and the rush of flood, charging straight through her rose gardens, across the stone walkways, and onto the lawn where her carefully arranged tables stood waiting with trays of finger foods and crystal wine glasses. From my porch, I could just make out the tops of people moving in a frantic scatter, pastel dresses dragging in the water, linen slacks splashed with mud. The white canopy sagged as the rising creek pulled around its supports. I imagined Patricia in the center of it all, her hat slipping sideways, her voice shrill as she barked orders that no one could follow. The water had no regard for social hierarchies, no care for money or control. It swept across her yard with indifference, uprooting flowers, overturning fountains, and carrying the smell of churned earth into the air. I thought about all the letters she had sent me, the threats, the smug comment about community resources, and I felt a grim satisfaction curl in my chest. She had wanted me to give up my water. Well, now she had it in abundance. But as the minutes ticked by, satisfaction gave way to something more complicated. I saw children crying as parents pulled them toward higher ground, shoes sloshing, clothes clinging. Guests stumbled, some losing purses or phones to the current. Caterers tried to salvage trays only to watch them float away like abandoned rafts. A band member lifted his cello high above his head, panic flashing across his face as he waded toward the driveway. And there, amid the chaos, was Patricia herself. I could see her from a distance, standing ankle-deep in what had once been a neatly trimmed lawn. Her hat was gone, her hair plastered to her face, her expensive summer dress darkened with water. She clutched her clipboard as if it were a life preserver, shouting at volunteers to do something, anything. But what could they do? No one can order back a flood once it's been set free. I admit, there was a moment, just a flicker, when I almost ran down there. I almost closed the gate, cut off the surge, and helped her clean up the mess. But then I remembered the smug tone in her voice when she told me, no one man should control the flow of nature. This wasn't my doing, not really. This was nature, released on its own terms. I had merely opened a door. Patricia had asked for balance, for fairness, for shared burden. Now she had it. And I wasn't going to rob her of that lesson. Still, I couldn't ignore the unease gnawing at me as I watched the aftermath unfold. Neighbors began gathering on the sidewalks, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others laughing nervously as though they weren't sure if this was tragedy or comedy. A few glanced my way, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. Did they know? Could they guess? My property sat upstream. The logic wasn't difficult. If the dam opened, the water came, and I was the only man with a hand on that wheel. But no one said it out loud, not yet. Instead, they murmured among themselves, watching Patricia's empire unravel in muddy waves. The party was over within an hour. Cars splashed out of the cul-de-sac, tires squealing against wet pavement. Guests soaked and humiliated, left with ruined clothes and ruined moods. The catering crew abandoned half their equipment in the waterlogged yard. By evening, only Patricia remained, standing in the wreckage of her once perfect garden. From my porch, I saw her drop the clipboard at last, sink onto the steps of her deck, and bury her face in her hands. For the first time since she'd moved into Pine Brook Hills, Patricia Holloway looked small, vulnerable, defeated. I should have felt triumphant. I should have raised a glass and toasted my victory. But what I felt was heavier, more complex. There was triumph, yes, but also pity, also fear, because I knew this wasn't the end. Patricia was not the type of woman to lick her wounds and move on. She was the type to rise from the mud angrier, sharper, and more determined than ever. And when she did, her eyes would be on me. Sure enough, the next morning, I woke to find not just a letter in my mailbox, but 3. One was a formal complaint accusing me of reckless water management, endangering community events. Another was an invoice for damages totaling nearly $50,000, payable within 30 days. The last was a personal note in Patricia's looping, furious handwriting. This isn't over, Daniel. You declared war, and you will regret it. I stood there on my porch, the letters trembling in my hand, the morning sun casting long shadows across the damp neighborhood. The air still smelled of wet soil and broken flowers. My reservoir, calm once more, gleamed like an accomplice that would never speak. I folded the letters neatly, placed them on my kitchen counter, and poured myself another cup of coffee. War, then. If that's what she wanted, that's what she would get. War has a way of changing a man, even when the battlefield is nothing more than a quiet suburban neighborhood with white fences and neatly trimmed lawns. Patricia had declared openly now, not in speeches or HOA meetings, but in the blunt scrawl of her letter. You will regret it. And I knew she meant every word. She was the kind of person who thrived on control, who needed to win at all costs, not just for herself, but for the image she projected to everyone else. Losing the garden gala wasn't just about ruined flowers or wasted money. It was about humiliation. It was about standing before her friends and her kingdom in mud-soaked defeat. And in her mind, I was the man who had taken that crown from her. The following weeks were a campaign of attrition. Patricia weaponized every inch of the HOA's bylaws against me, twisting vague phrases into accusations. I received notices for improper lawn edging, unsanctioned exterior paint hues, even though my house hadn't been painted in 5 years, and excessive vehicle presence because my brother had parked his truck in my driveway overnight. Each notice came with a fine, stacked one atop another, as though paper could bury me beneath its weight. She even tried to argue that my mailbox was non-conforming, despite the fact that it had been approved years before she ever set foot in Pine Brook Hills. But the fines weren't the worst of it. Patricia was clever, and she knew the real way to hurt me wasn't through money but through reputation. At the next HOA meeting, she stood in front of the community and declared me a reckless danger to the neighborhood. She claimed I had released water without authorization, endangering lives and property. She painted me as a loose cannon, a man obsessed with control, someone who hoarded a resource that should belong to everyone. And some of the neighbors, those who had been embarrassed at the gala, or those who feared her wrath, nodded along. It didn't matter that the law was on my side. In the court of public opinion, Patricia was the judge and jury. I sat in the back of the meeting hall, arms crossed, listening as she spun her tale. My instinct was to stand up, shout, remind everyone that my reservoir was private property, that the dam was mine, that she had no claim over any of it. But I knew better. Outbursts would only feed her narrative. So I stayed quiet, let her words wash over me, and studied the faces in the room. Not everyone believed her. Old Mr. Henderson, who fished at my lake every weekend, kept shaking his head. The Ramirez kids, who had learned to swim at my dock, whispered angrily to their parents. Even quiet Mrs. Thomas, who rarely spoke at meetings, raised a tentative hand to ask, "Isn't Daniel's reservoir on his deed?" Patricia brushed her off. Of course. But the question lingered. Seeds of doubt had been planted, and I knew how seeds worked. They needed only time and the right conditions to grow. Still, Patricia pressed harder. One afternoon, I came home to find a county inspector waiting in my driveway. He was polite enough, clipboard in hand, but the message was clear. Patricia had filed a complaint, claiming my dam was unsafe. I led him down to the reservoir, answered his questions, showed him the permits and the reinforcement work I had done over the years. He seemed impressed, even a little embarrassed, and finally signed off that everything was up to code. But the damage was done. Neighbors had seen the inspector's truck in front of my house. Rumors spread like wildfire. Did you hear Daniel's dam isn't safe? Someone said the county might shut it down. Patricia didn't need the truth. She thrived on whispers, on half-believed stories that chipped away at my standing little by little. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the distant frogs by the lake. I thought about all the years I had lived peacefully here, tending to my land, helping kids learn to fish, keeping to myself. And now I was a villain in my own story, cast that way by a woman who couldn't stand to lose. Anger coiled in me like a spring, but beneath it was something else. Resolve. If Patricia wanted war, then I would fight, but not with the same weapon she used. She had her gossip, her fines, her endless bureaucracy. I had patience, skill, and the truth, when wielded properly, can be sharper than any blade. I began documenting everything. Every letter, every notice, every fine. I cataloged them in binders. I took photographs of my property, time-stamped and organized. I recorded conversations when Patricia confronted me on the street, her voice dripping with venom as she accused me of stealing rainwater or endangering property values. Slowly, methodically, I built a case, not just for court, but for the day when the neighborhood would finally see who she really was. And in the meantime, I didn't let her break me. When she sent landscapers to inspect my yard, I greeted them with coffee and watched as they found nothing out of place. When she sent another inspector to my dam, I walked him through every safety feature until he shook my hand in admiration. Every time she tried to paint me as reckless, I countered her with calm, steady proof that I was anything but. But even the strongest dam can only hold so much pressure. The tipping point came one evening when I returned home to find Patricia herself standing on the edge of my dock. She wasn't supposed to be there. This was my property, my sanctuary. But there she was, arms crossed, her reflection trembling on the water. "You think you've won, Daniel?" she said without turning to look at me. "You think you can humiliate me and get away with it?" Her voice was low, controlled, but I could hear the fury beneath it. "This neighborhood will side with me. They always do. You can hide behind your paperwork and your dam, but eventually I'll tear it all down." I walked slowly toward her, the wood creaking under my boots. "You don't understand," I said, my voice calm but steady. "This isn't about winning. This is about what's mine. This lake, this dam, this land. It's not yours to control. It never was." She finally turned, eyes blazing in the twilight. "Everything is mine if I decide it should be." For a long moment, we stood there, staring at one another, the tension between us as taut as a cable. Then she stormed past me, heels clicking against the planks, and disappeared into the night. I watched her go, the ripples spreading out across the dark water, and I knew the war had only just begun. The weeks that followed Patricia's midnight visit to my dock felt like living under siege. I never knew what tactic she would try next, but I knew she wouldn't stop until she thought she had broken me. And yet, the strange thing was, the harder she pressed, the more resolve I felt building in me. I wasn't just defending a dam or a pond anymore. I was defending my right to live without being trampled by someone else's obsession with control. Every time I walked past the reservoir and saw the water shimmering in the sunlight, I felt a surge of pride. This wasn't something I had stolen. It wasn't some toy I was hoarding out of greed. I had nurtured it, invested in it, respected it. The water was a part of me, and Patricia would have to destroy me entirely if she ever hoped to take it. Her campaign escalated in ways that almost seemed absurd. She filed complaints with the county zoning board, alleging that my dam was an unlicensed hydroelectric facility. She claimed the water levels were endangering migratory birds. She even tried to sue me personally for emotional distress caused by the sight of my reservoir. Each attempt failed. The facts were too clear, the law too solidly on my side, but each failure only seemed to fuel her rage. She began patrolling the neighborhood like a general, clipboard always in hand, scanning every yard for infractions. People started to whisper behind her back. The same neighbors who had once nodded obediently at her meetings now rolled their eyes when she wasn't looking. I noticed more and more of them walking past my porch, pause and ask, "How's it going, Daniel?" with sympathetic smiles. The tide was turning, slowly, inevitably, but Patricia wasn't one to surrender gracefully. She needed one last grand gesture, something that would restore her authority, something that would remind everyone why they feared her in the first place. That moment came at the autumn HOA assembly, the largest meeting of the year. Dozens of homeowners crowded into community hall, the air thick with anticipation. Patricia stood at the front, her hair perfectly styled, her suit crisp, her smile wide but brittle. "We are here," she began, her voice ringing with authority, "to address a matter that affects the safety, security, and fairness of Pinebrook Hills. One resident has abused his so-called property rights to endanger us all. It is time we take decisive action." She clicked a remote, and a slideshow lit up the screen behind her. Photographs of the flooded garden party. Images of the dam from angles clearly taken without my permission. Charts, graphs, and a dramatic video clip of water surging down the creek. "This man," she declared, pointing at me in the back row, "believes he is above the community. He believes he can hoard nature itself. He unleashed a flood upon us once. What's to stop him from doing it again? Do we wait until homes are damaged? Until lives are lost? Or do we, as a united neighborhood, act now? Murmurs spread through the crowd. Patricia was a master at playing on fear, and for a moment, I felt the tide turning against me again. But then I stood. Slowly, deliberately, I carried my binders to the front of the hall. The room quieted. I set them on the table, opened one, and began to speak. "I've lived here 12 years," I said, my voice steady though my heart pounded. "This dam was built long before Patricia moved in. It is on my deed. It is inspected, reinforced, and maintained legally. I've paid every tax, every permit. I've stocked the water, invited your children to fish here, kept it safe for everyone, and I have documented everything." I flipped open the binders, letters from Patricia full of fabricated fines, photographs of the reservoir in compliance, permits stamped with official seals, recordings of her threats. Gasps rippled to the crowd as I read excerpts aloud, her words damning her in her own voice. I laid it all bare, the harassment, the false accusations, the abuse of power. Patricia's face tightened, her smile faltering as neighbors began whispering not about me, but about her. "This isn't about safety," I continued. "This isn't about community. This is about one person's need to control everything around her. And if you let her, she won't stop with me. Today it's my water. Tomorrow it's your yard, your mailbox, your home." The silence that followed was electric. Then Mr. Henderson stood. "He's right. Daniel's always been fair with that lake. My grandkids learned to fish there." Mrs. Thomas raised her hand next. "I've had enough of these fines for ridiculous things. Patricia, this has gone too far." One by one, voices joined in, not all, but enough. Enough to tip the balance. Enough to show Patricia her empire was crumbling. By the end of the night, a motion was passed. Patricia was to step down as HOA president, effective immediately, pending review of her actions. She stormed out of the hall, her heels striking the tile like gunshots, but the vote stood. For the first time since her arrival, Pinebrook Hills was free of her iron grip. In the days that followed, the neighborhood felt lighter. People smiled more. Kids played in the streets again. Some came to my lake, fishing poles in hand, and I welcomed them like always. The reservoir sparkled in the autumn sun, calm and steady, a reminder of both the chaos it had once unleashed and the peace it had helped me preserve. As for Patricia, she vanished almost overnight. Her house went up for sale, the for sale sign hammered into her perfect lawn like a final insult. Rumor had it she moved to another subdivision across town, though I pitied whoever had to deal with her next. I didn't rejoice at her downfall. Not exactly. I felt relief, yes, but also a strange kind of sorrow. She had wasted so much energy fighting battles she could never win. And for what? Control? Pride? A garden party? On quiet evenings, I sit by the dam, listening to the steady rush of water, and I think about everything that happened. The war, the flood, the humiliation, the victory. I think about how fragile peace can be, how easily one person's obsession can unsettle an entire community. But mostly, I think about resilience, the kind that grows stronger under pressure, the kind that holds steady when the floodwaters rise. My lake remains, my dam stands firm, and my spirit, tested but unbroken, flows on like the water itself.